Evening, everyone. I'm hoping this clicker's going to work. There we are. Brilliant. I'd like to introduce you to Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas is probably the greatest living scholar on the subject of the resurrection. He did his PhD thesis on the topic, and 50 years later, he's still studying it. He's recently published a book on evidences for the resurrection. I say a book, it's 3 volumes long. And you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about all of them this evening. The reason I've put him up on the screen is because Gary Habermas has pioneered a method of argumentation, which is based on taking historical facts that everybody can agree on, whether you're a believer or whether you're not a believer, and then make a case for the resurrection. So that's what I want to do for you this evening. I'm going to take one historical fact that everybody can agree on and make a case for the resurrection. And the fact that I want to rely on tonight is that the Christian church started in Jerusalem. That's it. Everybody can agree on that. And that's the basis of my case this evening. But we're going to come back to that. We'll come back to that later, because I want to tell you a story first. You see, there's some people in the room tonight who know me really well. And if you ask them, they would tell you that I have a habit of being in the right place at the right time to influence important events. And I'd like to tell you about one of those events this evening. Hopefully this button's going to work. I can't influence this, though. I don't know if you recognise that. That's Glasgow Airport, 2007. And terrorists tried to drive that car into the terminal to blow it up, and they didn't succeed. What's that got to do with me? Well, I live about 15 minutes from Glasgow Airport. I know exactly where it is and exactly how to get there. You don't seem very impressed. What about this? I have flown from Glasgow Airport more times than I can remember. I know exactly how it's laid out. I know exactly how it works. I can get from A to B really quickly and efficiently. No? All right. What about this? When this happened, several members of the public fought back against the terrorists with their bare hands. The most famous of which is a young man called John Smeaton. I was at school with John Smeaton. He was in the year above me. We weren't bosom buddies, we didn't hang out, but he would know who I was and I know who he was. So there you go, I know John. Better? Okay, what about this? In 2007, I was a member of the British Airport Authority Standards Committee. One of the roles of that committee was to work out how to stop terrorists blowing up airports. Yeah, you're interested now, aren't you? Yeah. It's a long time ago, 17 years ago now, so I'm not telling you anything that's going to put anything in jeopardy. But in that aftermath, we were really interested in what the key factors were that kept that car outside of the terminal. It was filled with thousands of people on that particular day. Now that you know that, I'd like to pose a thought experiment. This is Greta Thunberg. I'm sure you all recognize her. She's an environmental campaigner. What if she was to become the leader of the UK Green Party? And at the next general election, which I'm told might be in October, the Green Party were to win, and Greta Thunberg was to become our next Prime Minister. And I'd like you to imagine the first act of the Parliament was that she banned flying and all airports were to be turned into parkland for everybody to enjoy. Here's my question. Do you think I would forget where Glasgow Airport was and how to get there? Do you think I would forget how Glasgow Airport operated and how to move amongst it? Do you think I'd forget John Smeaton and what he did? Do you think I would forget the hours of my life that I sat in a committee room at Gatwick Airport trying to decide what size of bomb to design airports for? I can tell you right now, I wouldn't. It's still all up here. And if you were in my shoes, you wouldn't forget it either. What's that got to do with anything? Why am I telling you that? What's that story about? Well, what I'm trying to do is make an argument for you in a modern case that you can remember so that I can take that argument into the past. If you had been there in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, sorry, not the day of Pentecost, on Passover, Palm Sunday, get it right, when Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey, where there was crowds of thousands waving tree branches, would you forget that? If you'd been at the pool of Bethesda, when Jesus made a paralyzed man walk, would you forget that? If you'd been in the temple on the day Jesus arrived and overturned the tables, kicked out the moneylenders and the swindlers and the cheats, would you forget that? If you were there and saw him hung on a Roman cross publicly, would you forget that? And what about if you'd been there a few days later and seen him alive along with hundreds of other people? Would you forget that? You see, on the day of Pentecost, when the Apostle Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, stood up to address the crowd, that crowd was pregnant with expectation because the people were there and they remembered what happened and they needed somebody to explain it to them. And what Peter had to say is found in the book of Acts. And this is the first part of the sermon that he gave that day. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourself know. Why do you know? Because you were there. You saw it. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep his hold on him. What was the result of that sermon? I'm going to skip down, and I've decided I'm not even going to read everything that I've got there on the screen. I'm going to skip to the bottom bit. What was the result? Those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. 3,000. Imagine that. You preach a sermon and 3,000 people decide they want to follow Jesus. Why? Because the people were there. They saw it happen. If you want to see the next part of the story, read the rest of Acts. It's all about how the church started, how it got off the ground, and how it grew quickly. But do you know what? The Jews who responded and became Christians that day in their thousands, they weren't the only ones that noticed. There was another group of people who noticed as well, who were also there. Their imperial masters, the Romans, they were there too. They knew what happened. And I'd like to show you how we know that they knew what happened. This chap here on the left is called Titus. And he was sent by his father, Vespasian, to besiege and attack Jerusalem in AD 70, because the Romans had got a bit fed up with the people who were living there.
And he destroyed it. He flattened the place, razed it to the ground. And the relief that you can see on the right side comes from the Arch of Titus in Rome. And what you can see there is the Roman soldiers carrying off the contents of the Jewish temple. This is real history. This really happened. But Jerusalem didn't stay flattened. I'd like to reintroduce you to a fellow we met at Christmas. This is Emperor Hadrian. He came after Titus, and he wanted to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony. And that's what he did. And one of the first things he did was to build a temple. And he knew exactly what he was doing when he built that temple. Because in that temple, he put a statue of Jupiter right over the top of the place where Jesus' tomb was. And right over the spot where Jesus was crucified, he put a statue of the Roman god Venus. The Romans knew what had happened. They were there. This was a statement. We're in charge. Your god may have risen, but we're stood right on top of you. They knew what had happened. They were there too. But you see, that's not the end of the story. Because I'm going to reintroduce you to somebody else that we met at Christmas. This is Constantine. He was also the Roman emperor. He lived about 300 years after the crucifixion. But he became a Christian. And he wanted to venerate the holy sites in Jerusalem. But how would he know where they were? Hadrian had left a couple of statues marking the spot. So Constantine built a mausoleum over the tomb, and he built a church over the spot where Christ was crucified. Now, sadly, those buildings were irreparably damaged when a Persian invasion took place. But later, in the time of the Crusaders, a new church was built. And it's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the great dome is over the top of the spot where the tomb of Jesus rests. And the apse of the church is at Golgotha. That still exists today. You can go to Jerusalem. You can see that church. It marks the spot where these events took place. So bringing this all around and wrapping it all up, Jesus was a real person. He died on a Roman cross. His tomb was empty. And the people who were there in Jerusalem at the time came to believe and understand that he had risen from the dead. That's why we've got a Christian church. If that hadn't happened, there would be no Christian church. This building wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be sat here listening to me today. You see, the fact that the church was founded in Jerusalem is our fifth reason to believe. Thank you.